Selamat Selamat pagi, Bapak Ibu. Boleh menempati Bapak Ibu boleh silakan menempati tempat duduk yang di depan dulu, yang di belakang, karena sebentar lagi acara akan dimulai. Ladies and gentlemen, please be prepared. We are about to begin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Welcome to the public lecture, Gender and Power, What I Have Learned from 50 Years of Engagement with Indonesia. My name is Hayati Nufus. I'm your host for today, and we are pleased to hold this event in a hybrid format, live from the Widya Graha building in BRIN, Gatot Subroto, and also stream from the YouTube channel of the Research Center for Politics. A warm welcome as well to our audience joining us online from YouTube. Our public lecture today is hosted by the Research Center for Politics BRIN. Therefore, I would like to greet and express my gratitude to Dr. Atikah Nur Alami, the head of the Research Center for Politics, and we are honored to be joined today by Professor Kathryn Robinson, Emeritus Professor in Anthropology in the College of Asia and the Pacific, Australian National University, as well as our moderator today, Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi. To begin our event, I kindly invite everyone to stand for the singing of the Indonesian National Anthem, Indonesia Raya. Thank you, and please be seated. officially open our today's event, I would like to invite Dr. Atika Nur Alami, the head of the Research Center of Politics BRIN, to deliver the welcoming remarks. Mbak Atika, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nufus. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's public lecture on gender and power, what I have learned from 50 years engagement with Indonesia. And I think we are really to have Prof. Kathryn Robinson here with us to share your wisdom, your experiences, and your insight, of course, on the issues of gender and Islam in Indonesia. And I think I remember that the last time we met is during the Women in Asia conference in 2017 in Perth. And yeah, it was glad to meet you there. Yeah, and I think we are honored to have Prof. Kathryn here because we know that Prof. Kathryn has, very important works on exploring the interplay between gender, identity, Islam, maybe through anthropological kind of lenses. And I think it will bring, a different kind of how we look at this issue importantly. And I think Prof. Kathryn works, which, like I mentioned, try to integrate the anthropological lenses with a critical perspective on power, identity, and social change in Indonesia. I think it offers, kind of a profound insights for our study here in Indonesia. Yeah, you are. And I think in some of her study, she tried to also to challenge, kind of a Western-centric perspective, and also challenge particular stereotypes on women. I remember that, and I read in your works in 2023 on is Muslim marriage regulation. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, no worries, no worries. No, no worries. You're here in Indonesia. I always think of you in Holland. Oh, okay. Oh, so pleased to see you. Oh, this is my old friend. This book, my dear Carol. Yeah. Okay, maybe I can continue my remarks. No, no worries, no worries. I think we just like an informal kind of a lecture, so no need to be more kind of a kind of activities. Okay, I think I remember that in your study in 2023 on Muslim marriage regulation. Yeah, I think in that study you try to you explore the women's organization activism. I think by taking the case of Rahima and Alimat, yeah, how they challenge particular or a patriarchal stereotype, and this organization tried to engage with a state institution like the courts and parliament to reform the marriage law in Indonesia. I think it's quite a good, very important works also on Indonesia. And I think your works also on okay, okay. Your works also on everyday Islam in Eastern Indonesia is also, I think, I really enjoyed that book, and I think it brings a diversity on how gender and Islam has been practiced in different parts of Indonesia, and it challenged the Java-centric kind of approach also. I think it's really important, and I think from Prof. Robinson works, we can learn how the intersection between gender, Islam in Indonesia has been studied so far. And hopefully through our discussion today, we can find an academic gaps, Prof, that probably can provide opportunities for us to really discuss further about what actually the current issues regarding gender identity, social change in Indonesia. That will be, another topic for our discussion or our research also. So we can discuss also any possible maybe themes or issues regarding gender issues in Indonesia. I think that's all. I don't want to speak longer, so I will give more time for Prof. Kathryn to share again your valuable insight, experiences today. And again, thank you, Mbak Nia, for moderating today's lecture, and thank you, Lydia, as the coordinator for the research cluster on ethnicity, religion, gender, and politics in our center. And again, thank you, seminar team, for preparing and organizing this lecture. Hopefully, we will have a fruitful discussion, and lots of issue comes up from this lecture. Thank you again. That's all, Mbak Nia and Nufus. Thank you again for your coming, all the audience, and good luck for the for the lecture. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Dr. Atika, for the kind and insightful opening. And as a token of our deepest appreciation, we would like to present a souvenir to our distinguished speaker, Professor Kathryn Robinson. May I invite Dr. Atika Nur Alami once again to come forward and personally present the souvenir. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, let's move to our main agenda today, the public lecture by Professor Kathryn Robinson that will be guided by our lovely moderator, Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi. Allow me to read Dr. Kurniawati's short bio. Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi is a senior researcher at the Research Center for Politics. Her research interests are in gender and politics, women and politics, gender and Islam, local politics, and civil society. She is the founder and coordinator of the Gender and Politics Research Team at BRIN since 2015, and she received her doctoral degree in Asian Studies from the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies, Kyoto University, Japan in 2012. And she has been actively building networks with international feminists and scholars and was appointed as Secretary General of the ASEAN Association of Women's Studies from 2020 to 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator, Dr. Kurniawati Hastuti Dewi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nufus, for that kind of introduction. I actually doesn't expect that because I just doing my job as a moderator and chair for this session. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this very important event today. We are very delightful to have Professor Kathryn Robinson with us in this very important public lecture on the theme of gender and power in Indonesia. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Kathryn Robinson today with us. So Professor Kathryn Robinson is an Emeritus Professor of Anthropology in the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. She was the founder and editor of the Asia Pacific Journal of Anthropology from 1996 to 2012. Her primary research focus has centered on Indonesia, where she has dealt into various social issues, including gender relation, marriage, migration, mining, and everyday Islam. She has been diligently observing the evolution of these topics since 1970s until today. She is a former president of the ASEAN Studies Association of Australia from 2009 to 2010 and has supervised many higher degree theses, including many students from Indonesia. She is consultant on Koneksi, in which the Australian government collaborates with Indonesian government in developing GETSI. Some her important publications are Stepchildren of Progress, The Political Economy of Development in Indonesian Mining, published in 1986. And then I bring this book, Gender, Islam, and Democracy in Indonesia, published in 2009. I think this is a compulsory and, important reading list for any one of you who would like to study about gender development in Indonesia. And then her latest book is Marriage, Migration, Intercultural Families and Global Initiative, Intimacy, published by Palgrave in 2024. She has spent over 50 years conducting research on Indonesia and has actively engaged with Indonesian students and activists across Indonesia. In 2008, she received an Australian Teaching and Learning Council Award for Excellence in Supervision. So this is rather personal. I'm proud to be one of her former students in the Australian National University back then around 20 years ago in 2005 when I did my master degree at ANU. I must acknowledge that my experience and interaction with Professor Katie back then at ANU were truly an eye-opening moment for me. It laid a strong foundation for my continued interest, curiosity, and research in gender and politics until today. So it is a great honor for us to welcoming Professor Katie, who will share their insight of her 50 years engagement with Indonesia. However, before I hand over to the floor, just a few housekeeping notes that the lecture will last around 30 to 45 minutes with a 30 minutes Q&A session. So please hold your question at the end of the Q&A, after the Professor Katie finishes the talk. So without further ado, I give the time to Professor Kathryn Robinson. Please welcome Professor Kathryn Robinson.
This one. Okay. Okay. Well, is that working?
Yes.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you. And thank you for getting my old friend here. I'm so happy to see you. I think the last time I saw Noshabani, we were cooking in my kitchen in Canberra. Again, thank you very much to BRIN and to the research cluster for inviting me today. And this is a fairly informal talk, I think. I'm actually here at the moment between two training sessions for Connexi. I've just been in Kendari for 3 days, and tomorrow night I leave again for Manokwari to do 3 more days teaching research writing and GEDSI approaches for Connexi. And when Nia, who's a very fondly remembered, wonderful student, asked, and we wrote a paper together last year that was a fabulous experience. That I'll talk about that a bit at the end, I think. But she said to me, just talk about your experience and what you've learned in your career studying in Indonesia. I thought, okay, I'll give that a go. So this is a bit of what my mother would call a walk down memory lane. And as she said, I've been involved with research or exploration of Indonesia for about 50 years. I first came here in the 1970s firstly as a tourist, but then I chose to come back to Indonesia for my PhD research in 1997. And one of the things that interested me in coming in 1997 was the chance to do research in Sorowako, which was a very brand new mining project that had just been opened up with the change in foreign investment policy under the new order. And so this was very interesting to me with my interest in development that I'll talk about later. But this talk has I'll just show you. This is just, we've already talked about this a bit, but I've written and edited a lot of books that deal with issues of gender in Indonesia. I love the work I did on Islam in Eastern Indonesia, but I'm not really going to talk about that a lot today. But that was such an enjoyable piece of research to be done. These are just some of the things that I've published about Indonesia, apart from the book Gender, Islam and Democracy in Indonesia. I organised and co-edited the 2002 Indonesia update, which was soon after Reformasi, and took stock of a lot of the things that were happening as a result of women's activism in Indonesia. I had this other project with some colleagues where we looked at youth identities and social transformations, but a lot of it was about gender. And I just put this here. In the last few years, I've been writing a lot for, I don't know what you call them, those sort of crossover publications that have serious academic writing, but they're meant for more public audiences. And so this is an article that I wrote for East Asia Forum, which was an account of the talk that I gave at the Indonesia Update 3 years ago, which revisited the issues that we'd addressed at the Indonesia Update in 2001. So there's three strands in this talk that I'm going to try and weave together, so I hope you don't get confused and lost on the way. The first is the history of my own research engagement with studying gender relations in Indonesia, but I want to link it to changes or developments in approaches to studying gender relations, especially since the 1970s, since the beginnings of second wave sorry about the typos, and the changes I've witnessed in Indonesia in this period, and also very importantly, how working with Indonesian scholars, both as a research supervisor, but also just kind of hanging about and being involved in with some not very interesting women activists like my friend here, how these things have all been very influential and have informed my approach. So, so they're the three strands that I'm going to weave together. But while going through this analysis, I want you to think about a kind of a paradox that we find when we look at the literature that's been published, the academic literature about women or gender relations in Indonesia. And unfortunately, I see often when people say they're talking about gender, they're really only focusing on women, but we'll talk a little bit about that as the talk goes on. But to me, there's a curious kind of paradox that if we look at some of the historical studies of Southeast Asia, there's a kind of a stereotype that's been reproduced in a number of historical writings, starting with Sedez, that women in Southeast Asia have high status, right? It's just put out there as this, what does that mean? What does that mean? But when I read the research proposals, for example, that come through Connexi, I see that there's a tendency to talk about women in Indonesia still occupying their traditional roles. And there's an assumption that these traditional roles are domestic roles. Hold that contradiction in your head while we're talking. So, yeah, okay. So my own career as an academic anthropologist began in the 1970s, but this was also a moment of a particular kind of political activism, that is second wave feminism or women's liberation, that came out of the new left critiques of society and demands for social change that began in America, but also spread to Australia and Europe and other places. And this was very much an outgrowth of the political discontent that was critiquing American involvement in the Vietnam War, where, of course, Australia was also involved in sending troops. And I was very active in the women's movement on campus in Sydney University in the 1970s. And one of the things that we were doing as feminist students was developing critiques of the character of academic scholarship. We looked around and we saw that most of the people that were teaching us were men, but a large proportion of the student body and a majority in some disciplines were women. But moreover, this second wave feminist movement was developing critiques of academic disciplines that said, not only are they, is the research dominated by male researchers, but they are also gender blind in that often women are left out of the research reports. You know, they purport to be talking about all of society, but in fact, they mainly do research on men and talk about a world that's inhabited by men. And there's been a lot of discussion about this kind of critique in, for example, in medicine, where there's been a critique that drug trials or treatment trials are done on male subjects, but then the prescriptions or the directions for use of the drugs that come out of those trials don't take account of any physical differences between men and women. I don't know why that's doing its own thing. Why is it doing its own thing? This, yeah, okay. So, so when I came to do my research, that was the kind of intellectual climate that I was being formed in, as both a student of anthropology and as a political activist involved in women's, we called it women's liberation. You know, we were critical of institutions of society. I'm sure it's very familiar to people in Indonesia. We were critical of the institutions of society that excluded women, like politics, where there were very few women. We argued for women's reproductive rights because at the time, for example, abortion was illegal and it was quite difficult for women to get access to contraception. But the conceptual tool that was used by women in this early stage of feminism was the idea of sex roles, peranan seksual or peranan gender. That is the idea that the social participation of men and women was regulated by their by the societal differences in sex roles. For example, in Australia, I'm not up to that yet. So why is it doing its own thing? Why is it doing it? Oh. No, yeah. I don't know what's next. No, I'm not up. Oh, anyway. Okay, I'm not up to that yet. But anyway, I don't know what's happened to it. It's doing its own thing. It's gone crazy because I'm not up to this yet. Anyway, so we talked about sex roles. So for example, in Australia, at the time of my research, at that time in Australia, male wages were much higher than women's wages. And this was justified on the fact that men had to be paid a family wage. The assumption being that the men were in the workforce, women were at home, and so women didn't really need to earn very much, even if they were in the workforce. And this had been enshrined in industrial law through something called the Harvester Judgment that actually defined this thing called the family wage. And of course, this analysis of role theory, the need to look at the different social roles of men and women, entered into development discourse with the idea of women and development. So the critique that most development projects focused on male actors rather than women actors, and when there were development interventions, for example, in improving agriculture, from aid agencies in the developed world to countries in the so-called global south or underdeveloped world, they mainly focused on men. And even if women were, for example, farmers, they didn't get access to the new technologies and new knowledge. And this was recorded in a very famous book called Women's Role in Economic Development by Esther Boserup. So I've got confused now about where I'm at with my PowerPoint, but anyway. And so the idea that women in the Western world, so women in development had this idea, sorry, there's a lot of typos. I did this very early this morning, so apologies for that. This idea that, you know, you may remember that development used to be talked about in terms of something called modernization theory. And this was an assumption that with bringing technology, capital and know-how from Western developed countries, you would bring about development in the post-colonies that gained independence after World War II, and that the path that had already been trodden by the already developed industrial countries would be followed by these developing countries. And so by that logic, women in Western countries represented a kind of a pinnacle that countries like Indonesia could aspire to. But of course, that's much too simplistic and ignores the reality of the situation in those developing countries. But the global development movement became really transformational with the proclamation by the UN of the World Development Decade between 1970, the decade on women's development between 1976 and 1975. And you had the World Conference on Women in Mexico in 1975, which required that countries sign up to particular actions directed towards improving women's lives, improving gender equity. And of course, Indonesia has always very enthusiastically embraced its participation in these kinds of global fora. And the government at the time signed up to this and established the Ministry for Women's Affairs, the Menteri Urusan Peranan Wanita, which at the time was a much more serious kind of what they call women's machinery of government, than you had in a lot of other countries. So, for example, Australia had a women's advisor in the Prime Minister's office rather than a whole ministry dedicated towards women's affairs. So this was the state of play when I began my doctoral research in Sorowako. I've got some pictures of, there we go. This is what Sorowako looked like when I began my fieldwork in the 1970s. It was a rural village that became sucked into this large mining development. The people lost their agricultural land, which was handed over to the company for a very modest amount of compensation to build the company mining town, and very importantly, a golf course for the recreation of the managers. So what I found in Sorowako when I first went there, in terms of this kind of analysis that was informed by women's roles, was that women who previously had an equal role with men in agriculture, because they all went to the fields together, they planted, they harvested, men and women had access to land, etc., had changed to a situation where there was very little agriculture because they'd lost their sawa for the golf course. And the company only employed men as industrial workers, either in the process plant or in the mines. The few jobs for women were as what we would call sort of customary female roles, or the female roles that were customary for women in countries like Australia at the time, like secretaries, nurses, and for unskilled labour, it was being servants in the mess or working as domestic servants in private homes. So, okay. So, yes. So, but while I was engaged in this research and thinking about the kinds of theoretical lenses we could use to understand what was happening in this case, in this case, the sort of theoretical lenses or approaches we had to describe women's roles in this society, there was a lot of criticism of the way that roles were very limited in their, it's doing it again. Why is it doing it again? They were very limited in their why is it doing that? In their explanatory power. Sorry, there's another. They're very limited in their explanatory power. And so you found that a lot of feminist theories started moving towards what were called categorical theories. That is, rather than thinking about social roles, male and female roles, as attributes of individuals that people were socialized into, they began talking in terms of categorical theory. That is, that you could explain gender inequity and you could develop a gender politics based on theories of men as a group versus women as a group. and this, of course, gave rise to the widespread use of the concept of patriarchy and the idea that you had this, this patriarchy that was a universal construct that operated in a universal way across all societies. And so this very much reflected the kind of thinking behind New Order ideology, which designated roles for women as a group in relation to men as a group, so that women were categorized as housewives and managers, whereas men were categorized as household heads. And this was given an institutional kind of formation in Indonesia by the corporatist organisations of Dharma Wanita and the PKK, where women were enrolled. Now, in Sarawako, when I was doing my fieldwork in the 1970s, you didn't have Dharma Wanita and PKK, but the elite managers' wives who lived in the company town site, as distinct from the village, established something that they called the Inco Families Association, where they inculcated a kind of a version of this. And so what they tried to do was inculcate in the village women a kind of a, oh, see, why is it doing that? Oh, it's not connecting. Okay. Okay. So, sorry, this is really throwing me off because I don't know where I am in between the PowerPoint and the talk. So what they were doing was quite self-consciously trying to inculcate in the village women a kind of a model of femininity that fitted with the kind of state definitions of what were appropriate roles for women. And so, for example, in the context of the Wives Association, women were wives. They were called Ibu X or Ibu Y, like Ibu Patahudin or Ibu Ibu Nasrul, whereas within the context of the village, they were always known by technonymous terms as, you know, the mother of Patahudin or the mother of Farid or something like that. And so I was at a number of these meetings, which were quite hilarious because they'd be collecting the money for the Arasan and saying, Ibu Farid, ini siapa dia Ibu Farid? Oh, mamahnya si Adlin. Begitu. So it was very confusing for them. And also the Wives Association tried to train them and form them into a particular kind of housewifery, like teaching them what they saw as appropriate ways of cooking or the ways of looking after their children. That is that it assumed that they had a kind of a lack. Now, the limits of categorical theory, which I'd love to show you if I could get it up on the screen. It's up on my screen, but it's not up. There we go. The limits of categorical theory were that it was assumed that all men were powerful and all men were powerless. But we know that this isn't true, that all men are not powerful, that some women in society exercise power, and also a lot of men are powerless. And in the case of both role theory and categorical theory, you came up against the problem that if you tried to say why someone was attributed to a particular social role or why you tried to say that someone was relegated to a particular social category, you only had one answer, and that was going back to biology. So both ended up in a crude kind of biological determinism that really got you nowhere, because you couldn't say that the lives of all men and the lives of all women in society were the same. Now, I've got an example somewhere here, but I'll give it to you now. A very good example of how this plays out and why it's not possible to talk about men as a group versus women as a group, and that social difference is organised only in terms of these differences that relate back to biology, would be the research that was done by Anne Stoler in Java in the 1970s, where she looked at harvesting practices. And she found that at that time, when there was still a lot of sawa and people harvested by hand, when someone was about to harvest their field, they'd call people to come and help them. Now, if you were specifically invited, which was a practice that happened between members of elite landowning households, you got a larger proportion of the amount of paddy that you picked in terms of your payment than the landless women who just turned up. And so this was a very good example of what we would now talk about as intersectionality, or the way that those gender differences were intersected by class differences between people who owned land and people who didn't own land, in terms of establishing a kind of social differentiation. But the New Order very much employed this kind of categorical approach in the 1974 marriage law, in defining men as the household heads and women as the housewives or managers of the household. But the marriage law also exemplifies or encapsulates some of the contradictions of this striving for organising state power in terms of categorical gender theory. And the law also responded to long-standing demands from the very well-established and old pre-colonial roots of the women's movement in Indonesia, where demands for a secular marriage law had been a crucial aspect of their struggle. And so this 1974 law did give women some rights in regard to marriage and divorce that they had hitherto been denied. For example, the law defined grounds on which women could seek for a divorce, but also, in accord with the women's demands, restricted polygyny. So already it's not a straight manifestation of this idea of men as powerful and women as powerless, and that this is what's reflected in the law. But in general, we can see that the power given to men as household heads reflected what Connell calls the patriarchal dividend, that whereas that men were kings in their own household, and so the idea of the patriarchal dividend is that in situations where we can see that all men are not powerful, we can see that gender relations are very important in the exercise of power in society, in that the power that's captured at the elite level, at the central level, which is on the whole captured by male actors, gives rewards to men who are not powerless from that arrangement. And we call this the patriarchal dividend. And in the case of Indonesia, we can see the designation of men as household heads is part of this patriarchal dividend. And so, for example, until quite recently, men were free to bash their wives. You know, they were the kings in their own households. It was the same in Australia in the 1970s. And that was one of the aspects of gender relations that we argued against as, oh goodness, as feminists, that, you know, in Australia then it wasn't, domestic violence was not a crime. And if a neighbour called the police because there was a ruckus going on at the family next door, the police would say, oh, it's a domestic mate, okay, sorry, and go away. So just as you've had that struggle in Indonesia to have domestic violence declared a crime, the same thing happened in Australia in the 1970s. Hang on, I'm running out of time, so I better get a move on. So the approach that I've moved towards in terms of my own research is what's termed a gender relations approach, which is a kind of a structuralist approach that, instead of trying to look at men and women as blocks, either as individuals carrying a particular kind of social role or as belonging to a particular group, men versus women. We look at different structures in society and try and understand the way that gender relations or gender difference is implicated in those different structures of society. And I very much follow the work of R.W. Connell in adapting this gender relations approach, which is the approach that I attempted to use, whether successfully or not, in this book, Gender, Islam and Democracy. And so in gender relations theory, the structures that Connell advises us to look at are politics, economics, symbolism and ideology, and what she now calls cathexis, or attachment in adult sexual relationships. And this is to do with the fact that even though gender relations theory moves away from the idea that biology is deterministic, biology is, of course, important in understanding the relationships between men and women. And so Connell talks about the way that the exercise of power in politics, economics, symbolism and ideology enrolls what she calls the reproductive dimension. And this relates back to what is called cathexis, or attraction, in terms of social reproduction, by which, of course, we mainly mean marriage. And so this is the idea that societies create different ideological or symbolic appreciations around masculinity and femininity, which relate to sexual attractiveness or relates to the kinds of criteria that people would use, for example, in specifying what would be a successful jodoh. Kalau mau menjodohkan anaknya, then you look to various of these ideological or symbolic aspects of gender relations in order to decide, who's going to be a good spouse for your child. So this relates to the importance of the enrolment of the reproductive arena in the process of gender relations. Okay. We're out of sync again. Sorry, I'm trying to rush through this because I've badly timed it. Okay, so in terms of a gender relations approach, we can see that throughout the Indonesian archipelago, there is not one kind of set of relationships that we can call traditional gender relationships. Here we go. We can see that there are multiple gender orders and multiple gender regimes by looking at the constituent societies of the Indonesian archipelago. Societies differ in terms of attributions of power, in terms of economic arrangements, in terms of symbolism, and also in terms of social reproduction and the enrolment of affect in social reproduction. And so, for example, if you're using a gender relations approach, we need to think about what are the sources of power that can be attributed to male actors or female actors. What are the economic roles, both the sexual division of labour in detail. So who does what, like men use the dibble to make the holes in planting, and women follow behind and fill the holes. But importantly, who has access to productive resources? Who owns the land? Is there a difference between the access that men and women have towards land, and what does this mean in terms of their social power and their social relationships? Now, that's probably not at all clear, but anyway. Oh, I just want to finish by talking a little bit about, because I was with Bulis Marcos in Kendari kemarin, and she said to me, I have to talk about training. And in terms of my career, a lot of the things that I've come to know about Indonesia, it's because of the kind of enrollment that I've had in this sort of engagement that I've had. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by this PowerPoint. The engagement that I've had in research training in Indonesia. So, for example, when I finished my PhD in the early 1980s, I then came to work in Makassar at the Pusat Latihan Penelitian Ilmu Sosial, then Ujung Pandang, the PLPS Ujung Pandang, under the authority of YIS, where I trained Indonesian researchers in field research techniques. And I had the privilege of going and visiting them in the field. So I know a lot about all sorts of remote and funny little corners of South Sulawesi. Since then, I've been involved in a lot of different training exercises with respect to Indonesia. I've supervised an awful lot of PhD students like Pak Adlin and Gita, and Nia was MA student at the ANU. And with all these students, I've had the privilege of visiting them in the field and learning a lot from working with them as they conduct their research. I've also had the privilege to work with a number of wonderful women activists in a number of different activities and exercises over the years, like Bruno Shabani. And all of these things have enabled me to deepen my knowledge and understanding of what happens across the Indonesian archipelago, and so that my understanding isn't just based on my own detailed research, which has been going on for the last 50 years in the mining town of Sorowako. So this has been a great privilege for me and has really contributed to the deep kind of understanding I have. I mean, another training exercise that I was engaged in was the Aceh Research Training Institute that was established after the tsunami to attempt to fill some of the gap in Aceh because of the huge loss of educated people, including one of my own former peserta PLPS from Ujung Pandang. And so that was also a great privilege. So it's a very different world today than when I began my PhD. We've been through the transformation from the New Order, Reformasi, and this very much, I think, relied upon and relied upon the kinds of interventions by feminist activists leading up to Reformasi. Don't forget, it was the women of Suara Ibu Peduli who first went out on the streets to link very cleverly, just showing you that we haven't had much time to talk about this, but in terms of a gender relation theory, they were very cleverly able to take that ideology of the New Order, which said they were responsible for the management of their households, to protest on the basis of the fact that they couldn't support their households because of the economic privations associated with the global financial crisis with Chrismon. I think there's been a huge change in both in politics and economics related to gender relations in Indonesia. Democratization after the laws introduced during the Habibie presidency have allowed women gradually to take a much greater role in public politics. Very importantly, the passage of the legislation about the 30% quota, which exemplifies another thing that I was going to mention, but I left myself not enough time, which is the importance of global discourses in association with national discourses in forging political agendas. So the women's movement were very effectively able to harness that UN discourse around quotas and the figure of 30% to get legislative changes in Indonesia, which has had an effect. I've got a table here that I prepared for my talk to the 2022 Indonesia update. I haven't updated this table, I'm sorry, since the last elections, but it shows that Indonesia has been making very steady progress. You know, what's the old expression we used to use? 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards, but basically in the right direction in terms of increasing women's political representation. There've also been enormous changes in women's work and women's employment. I mean, another one of these wonderful contradictions that came out of policies during the New Order, they were very, that government was very keen to improve education rates, partly in order to make the Indonesian population ready as a workforce for foreign investment. And they attracted a lot of foreign investment in the form of the clothing, footwear, textiles and electronics factories, initially mainly in Java. But again, in an interesting kind of twist on how these things work and how the global interacts with the national or the local, those companies on a global level preferentially preferred female employees. So in spite of the fact that you had this this thing in the marriage law that said women had primarily a domestic role and it was men who were meant to go out and be the heads of households and earn the wages and all that, you had all these households where the person who was getting the regular monthly wage was a young woman who managed to get work in one of these factories. And in terms of my own research in Sorowako, there's been a really dramatic change from the situation that pertained in the 1970s, where women were not employed in the mine or the process plant. Again, I think probably as a result of global changes in the mining industry, they now employ quite a large number of women as operators in the mine. When I was there a few years ago, about 20% of the 250 operators of the massive machinery were women. You can see that woman standing up there on top of that giant truck wearing her jilbab and her hard hat. And these women are incredibly proud of their ability to drive these massive machines. They are also undertaking skilled employment. The woman sitting on the large tyre is a friend of mine who's a senior chemist who works in the factory's process plant. And there's another friend of mine who's sitting up there in the cabin of her giant machine. So I think probably these changes in the policies of the multinational mining corporations relate back to changes brought about by feminists in other countries where they've had the implementation of equal employment law, so that they've had to change their employment practices in countries like Australia or Canada to employ women in all aspects of their enterprises. But that's something that I'm still researching. That's a question that I'm still trying to answer. But anyway, things have changed a lot. And I think now too, there's a lot of very important Indonesian scholars who are the public intellectuals who are driving the debates around these issues. And for example, Dr. Nia and I wrote a paper together last year, and it was a very interesting exercise for me because I think we found in writing that paper that there was a difference in our perspectives, and she brought to bear a very important perspective, which was a perspective from Southeast Asia, to the kinds of conclusions that we came to. And you can all wait to read that paper when it comes out. So anyway, thank you. I'm sorry I went on for so long and became a bit unclear in the middle because I prepared too much, but never mind. I hope you got something out of that in terms of what a lot of fun I've had, how interesting it's been, how appreciative I am of the opportunity I've had to have such a deep engagement with Indonesia. It's definitely an engagement that's enhanced my life, continues to do so. When I was in Sulawesi Tenggara kemarin, one of my former students, who's a professor at Unhalu, said that, he said, "Boo, it's very good you're coming and doing this training in Indonesia so you don't become pikun." So thank you. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Prof. Kathy, for very wonderful and thoughtful lecture today. Actually, it's unfair, yeah, because you have more than 50-year experience, and then it's wrapped up only for 35 to 40 minutes in this public lecture. But this is the beauty of public lecture, you know. And I just want to recall highlighting some important point by Professor Katie. Prof. Katie actually lucky enough, yeah, to be brought and surrounding by 1970 situation of second wave of feminisms, and then due to that situations, then she developed a kind of activism and criticism in campus, right? And then she consistently doing the research on feminism and reflecting into Indonesian case during her PhD degree in Sorowako. So early engagement is in Sorowako, which is part of Eastern Indonesia. And then along the way from her explanation, we can see that the changing situation from the agricultural base of surrounding area in Sorowako gradually changing into non-agricultural situation, including today's. And then if we can see previously perhaps women in Sorowako area may be secluded because of the transformation situation from agriculture to non-agricultural base. But from your explanation, more women also in local area and in local region at that area are also assuming position, yeah, in some capitalist company in that area. That's also interesting part to be observed further. But without further ado, I would like to open a Q&A session. Perhaps any audience in here would like to ask some question or maybe reflecting into their own experience relating to what Professor Katie has been shared with us today. Maybe 3 questions. Any one of you? I show as well some of his former PhD student in this room as well. Professor Adlin Sila, welcome, Professor Adlin. Anyone would like to asking some question or opinion or reflecting into the, okay, please introduce yourself and use the mic.
Yeah, boleh. Boleh.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's up to you, Indonesian or English.
I try to speak English, Miss Kathryn. So thank you for opportunity. So I think the presentation of Prof. Kathryn is very insightful for me because the topic is like a traditional culture in Indonesia, especially focused in gender and religion. So my question, the first is we flashback in New Order. So I have research from the like cinema. So I think the from my research, I found like the the policy of New Order, like from the New Order and post Reformation, it's like why it's informal question, Mr. Miss Kathryn. So the majority because I focus in film, so like
yeah.
horror film,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
majority goes are it's like from female, the culture of Indonesia. And next, the religion. I have found the new pattern in religion, like if we go flashback in New Order, when the bad and the good fight each other, so always bad is always good is always win. So the name is Muslim cleric, you know, like the Ustad in Indonesia is always win in the cinema. But after Reformation, the Satan is win. And
The Satan is.
yeah, the new pattern, I think. So I need your response and your opinion about my finding research, like in cinema in Indonesia, based on the gender in the ghost of female, and next about the pattern, new pattern in Muslim clerics always lose when fight with the Satan.
Yeah.
So this is
Very
my
interesting.
question. Okay,
That's
thank you.
very interesting. And I suppose, I mean, I don't know about film. That's your expertise. But I suppose if I was talking with you and you were saying, well, what do I do next and what do I do about this? I think using a gender relations approach, you'd focus on the gender symbolism and try and think about how that gender symbolism relates back to other aspects of other structures in social life, how it relates back to, say, maybe, I mean, does it have a relationship to shifts in political power where women are assuming more political power, or does it reflect back to these changing economic relations where women are assuming greater roles in the public sphere as economic actors? I don't know. They're the sorts of questions that I guess I'd be, but it's a very interesting observation. And so if it is a historical shift, as it is a historical shift as you're describing, I'd be really interested to know what else is happening in terms of that's making that gender symbolism appeal to people. Is that helpful comment to you? Does it?
Okay, maybe I can question for me.
Yeah, just does that sound to you like a useful way to think about it?
Yes. In my opinion, Prof. Kathryn, like I looked the cover of book like traditional Java, pengantin. Yes. So I think the influence of the culture of Java is still dominant in politics and in culture in Indonesia. So when we go to cinema and movie, so the influence is still dominant. Like I said, the ghost always female. Yeah, because we like Benedict Anderson said, the culture of the power of Java, the book in Benedict Anderson like kekuasaan Jawa. Nah, I said it's like I think the influence is very dominant. So yeah.
So you don't think it's related to anything going on in the contemporary world?
No, but it's related in film and in the reality. Like,
but the thing, as an anthropologist, I think the concept traditional is very problematic. What do we mean by traditional? People use it all the time in Indonesia, and they mean different things by it all the time, because the point is cultures aren't like footballs that you say, here, have my culture, have my culture, have my culture, dan diterima sebagai sesuatu yang utuh. Culture has to be reproduced, and it's reproduced under conditions of power. And so it's always really important. I think if you find yourself wanting to use the word traditional, ask yourself, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? Do I mean something that belongs to the beliefs or the practices of a previous generation? Because cultures always have to be reproduced. You know, like if they're not reproduced, then it's lost. You know, and there has to be, things aren't reproduced in a random way. They're reproduced by people's active behaviors and active practices, you know, like, for example, can I think of, what's a really good example of that? For example, if if you go to a village where a lot of the children have gone away to school for many years, and if you put them all on a bus and said, we're taking you back and we're going to put you in a very traditional sawa with bibit dulu dulu, and you have to look after this sawa, they wouldn't know what to do because you don't have the conditions of reproduction, you know? And so the same's true with gender relations. They get reproduced under different conditions. And so, for example, you can say, oh, there's the traditional role of men and the traditional role of women. But I'll give you an example. In NTT, again, because of global factors, when Indonesia finally got legislation that would facilitate and enable tenaga kerja, bukan tenaga kerja pada umumnya ke luar negeri, at that time in the Middle East, there were no more jobs for men. They'd all been taken by Filipinos and the construction was finished. So then they said, oh goodness, well, it'll have to be the women. So in a lot of villages, you had a lot of out-migration of women. So what does that mean in terms of reproduction of so-called traditional, if you want to call them that, gender relations? And I can best explain it with a concrete example. I was once in a village in NTT and I went to the river and there was some washing on a stone, yeah? And I thought, oh, where's the person who's doing this washing? Then a man came out wearing a towel and I said, oh, is that your washing? Yes, he said, istri saya sudah saya lupa ke mana ya, ke Taiwan atau ke Saudi atau bagaimana. Terus dia bilang, and he was making a joke. He said to me, saya sudah peran ganda. And it was a joke. You know, he was making a joke, making a sort of a joking reference to state ideology, right? But, you know, in the household, the reproduction of gender roles is, or the division, I won't say gender roles, the reproduction of the division of labour by sex, which is more accurately what we're talking about, is influenced by the fact that it's the women who have the opportunities to work overseas. So you have to be really careful using traditional. And if I would say that if you're trying to do research in Indonesia and the women are, say it's a rural area, I don't know about the cities. I don't know about the cities. That's you guys, that's your knowledge. But in rural areas, if women have a primarily domestic role, you need to ask why. Because it's not normal. Because in most parts of Indonesia, women have an economic role, they have some kind of role in politics, and these things change all the time. And they change also because people want them to change. Like I marked, I can't remember the name of the author, which is unfortunate, but I marked a wonderful thesis based on research on wirid in North Sumatra many years ago. And from that thesis, I learned that the women in that community who are running the wirid quite explicitly saw them not just as a religious activity, but an activity to prepare women to have confidence so they could start participating in village elections, which were starting to become a thing. So, you know, so the conditions of reproduction are impacted by people consciously trying to change them. Same with religion. You know, there's a lot of people trying to consciously change the way people in Indonesia practice religion. You know, so you get a lot of different practices coming in that fulfill different sorts of, for example, you know, in Sorowako, a couple of years I was there and they said there was this wedding between two young people who were students at UNHAS in technical faculties, and they'd started following Islamic practices that were different from the practices of their parents, right? And so they had this ceremony that everyone there called Kawin Islam, with a tabir down the middle, yeah? Which made everyone really confused. The bapak especially didn't like it because they normally went to the wedding with their istri, young who took her handbag, dan dia yang bawa amplop. Jadi, when the time came to shake the hand and make your contribution, I don't know if you do that everywhere, but that's what they do there. The laki-laki dimalukan karena they did that. And my friend who explained this to me, he said, "Oh, it was all right for me." He said, "I knew, so I had my envelope in my pocket." He was laughing, well, a bit amused and laughing about the fact. But I noticed that at the nikah, which was run according to the imam's rules, they had to duduk bersanding. After the what do you call it, the kabul, when the ijab kabul, when the bride comes out, she had to sit side by side, even though they didn't want to do that at the resepsi, because that was the imam's rules, right? And his rules. So there's a lot of things going on there in terms of reproduction of practices, you know, that the imam is, he says he's acting on the basis of an instruction he has from the Department Agama, that the wife has to sit next to the husband while he reads the tahlak on the back of the buku nikah, you know. That he said, what's the point if she doesn't hear it? That was his point. You know, so a lot of things going on about reproduction of religious practice. No, not necessarily tradition of religious practice. Some of it traditional, some of it new. So if you say it's tradition, you have to say, what do I mean? What do I mean by tradition? You know, because it's a specific character of practices, something that's traditional. But I think that mostly what people call traditional gender roles, when I read current writing in Indonesia, they don't mean traditional gender roles. They mean an organisation of gender roles that's in accord with the practices that were instituted under the new order, which was a kind of social engineering, you know? So it's not traditional. It's not traditional at all. So if I'm reading something, if someone submits an article to the journal, I'm reading a research proposal, it's traditional gender roles, no, you know this, don't you, Gita? No, not, you know, what are you talking about? You have to describe it, and don't use traditional. It's a bit lazy to say traditional, you know? If what you're trying to say is something was happening, like, for example, in NTT, men did this and women did that. Now it's changing because perempuan yang menjadi TKW, but don't say traditional. Say what you really mean. What are you talking about? What are you describing? That women did this and men did this, and now women did this and men do this. So hati-hati sekali if you want to use traditional, because traditional also, remember I said that women and development theory drew on the logic of really old theory, modernization theory that was current in the 50s and the 60s, that underpinned the kind of, you know, the theories of the new order about, you know, tinggal landas and all of that kind of thing. But that was based on a truly false assumption that you had traditional societies and modern societies. And a society like Indonesia was backward, traditional, and it had to undergo certain transformations to make it like, a modern industrial society with attributes that even most Western societies don't conform to. You know, so, you know, that this idea that somehow the situation of women in Western societies was a kind of a pinnacle, when you've all seen Mad Men, haven't you? You seen Mad Men, the TV series Mad Men? No. But, you know, this 1950s housewifery, that was a historical moment in Western societies post-World War II, where women had gone out of, you know, women had gone heavily into industry and so on to support the war effort. You know, in Australia, the Department of Manpower sent people here, there and everywhere in order to do work to support the war effort. But when the men came back from the war, this is a bit of a gross generalisation, but the women were sent back to the domestic sphere so that the men could get back into the public sphere and their jobs. So always be really careful about traditional, yeah? You have to say, how is it being reproduced? If you're saying something's being done now, that's a traditional practice from many years ago, I'm going to say to you, how has it been reproduced? If it hasn't been changed, why not? And but usually during the whatever of social reproduction, something changes. Like, for example, in Indonesia, maybe the intention of introducing keluarga berencana in the 1960s was to limit, then everyone was worried about overpopulation. Oh, too many people, too many babies. So there was a global movement to have countries like Indonesia, where people still had large families, to limit their production. So you had the government policies distributing was called keluarga, but distributing contraception and using other instruments such as, rice allowances for civil servants and so on, to try and introduce people, all those dua anak cukup all over. Did you all grow up in villages where you had those, patun dua anak cukup, yeah? But what's happened as a consequence? If the government, when the government did stop distributing contraceptives after Reformasi, when you no longer had the central BKKBN, what happened? Did people go back to having 6 or 8 children? Not necessarily. All right.
Population can give some insight or overview. Maybe we can continue for the next.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Pop culture.
Yeah. But pop culture, very important. But I would say go and link that to other aspects of social relations, social life and power. That's what I would say.
Interesting. Anyone would like, please mention your name, Because I have my
Good morning, everyone. My name is Venus. I'm undergraduate anthropology student at Universitas Pajajaran. Prof. Kathryn, thank you for your fruitful and insightful what you learned from the 60 years of experience in Indonesia. And I just want to say that I am doing research towards PKK or Dharma Wanita right now for my final thesis, and specifically in Posyandu. And it seems I see that the movement is stronger and it's enduring the woman empowerment, despite some opinions stating that
Yep.
Posyandu and Dharma Wanita is reflecting patriarchy. And based on your 50 years of experience in Indonesia, I just want to say, what's your opinions about this? Is there any differences, or is there any same relations that happens of the policy or any other things? Thank you.
What do you think?
This is make me so confusing because in other hand, the PKK movements is make the women empowering, that they know themselves as a woman that can empower. But in other hand, the policy and then the situation makes the woman tends to play traditional roles that.
What do you mean by that? You mean as mothers?
Yeah.
Don't call it, you don't have to call that, I don't know why you say that's traditional,
No, social expected social roles
Yeah.
as mothers.
I know, yes, I know, I've seen, not lately, I haven't been in a Posyandu lately, but I have situations in Posyandu, in urban Makassar during the New Order, where if a mother was working and so the child was brought to the Posyandu by a grandmother or a neighbor or something, that sometimes they'd be tegur or But I think PKK is really interesting. I think it's really interesting because so far as I know, it was a very effective way to bring health services to communities. Like for example, I did some research on Posyandu in Makassar at one point, and the staff from the Puskesmas would use their own money to night becak to go here, 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 because they realized the value, you know, that they were providing the pregnancy exams, the vaccination for children, the weighing of the children in situ. And I think it's like, you know, Posyandu may have been established, first of all, as a corporatist organisation with the idea that you inculcate a particular gender ideology or something or other in the people. But, you know, people have their own agency and their own actions. And I mean, I noticed with myself that in situations where you had a very, even, you know, back in Orde Baru, if you had a very effective and dynamic Ibu Desa,
Yeah.
who ran a very good posyandu, it was very dynamic and very, whereas if it was just done begitu, then, you know, it's just a way of making people do something. So it's not always the same. But I must say, I was at a conference in Canberra a few years ago where they asked me to be a discussant. And one of the papers, I don't know what she was thinking, but this person gave this analysis that she thought she discovered that the PKK wasn't an autonomous, you know, growing up from the people women's organisations. And I thought, what's she been reading? You know. But anyway, so but I think that's interesting. And I also know with I have a number of friends actually who found themselves as the head of Dharma Wanita, you know, because you know, they're from dual career families where the husband gets some sort of becomes pejabat and they're responsible for the PKK. And you can probably guess who it is, but one person who then decided that as the head of the Dharma Wanita, she'd invite people to give them lectures on child psychology and this kind of thing. And they loved it. And so happy to no longer be asked to participate in pyramid schemes or buy sets of cookware, or, you know, other such activities. So that, and another friend of mine who was the head of a rumah sakit, and she used the Dharma Wanita as a way to instruct people about children's health. And, you know, so I think there's always people's agency, you know, so as much as the government might try to, you know, co-opt and establish social control, I think that was really clear with the way that women responded around reformasi, you know, that women were very strong political actors at that time. And using that definition of maternal roles, Bruno Shibane just said, but one of my activist friends who's of the same generation to me, you might all know this story, but told me that they all got together to cook food in some of their kitchens to send to the students occupying the parliament, because there were stories that there'd been McDonald's orders and things sent there, and they were worried that they might be poisoned or tampered with in some way. So they took it upon themselves, you know, a kind of a maternal kind of role. We're going to provide the food, but the way they did it was to try and support the students by making sure that they got food that they knew was safe food because it was delivered from their own private kitchens. So, you know, there's ways that people can interpret these roles. You know, like me as an academic, there's no way I'd model myself on the behaviour of a lot of male academics. You know, I'm a girl, you know, I'm a mother, I'm a woman, and it impacts the way that you carry out your, social role.
Is it clear enough? Or okay, maybe we can continue after the session, yeah. But yes, I also agree with Prof. Katie about the PKK, because I also did this research on PKK in urban Indonesia, urban Jakarta, around 4 years ago, 2019 until 2021. And then I saw this, what we call the PKK members, actually very active in promoting RPTRA, Ruang Publik Terpadu Ramah Anak, yeah, in which, you know, previously there is no lactation room, and because of this agency of the PKK member, then there is a lactation room since the beginning of the, you know, pilot project of this RPTRA. And then they're also active in promoting the violence against women or domestic violence among the, surrounding area, RT, RW.
Yep.
And then according to my interview with them, they believe that because I'm a member of the PKK, I'm Pokja 1 or Pokja 2, so I have responsibility to advocate this woman
Yep.
who experience violence. So by becoming member of the PKK, they are feeling empowered collectively, not only individually. So yeah, I suggest that not only we saw this perception of the PKK or Dharma Wanita as the state organized women groups, but
That was its origin.
yeah,
not
but not
necessarily
necessarily
its
is the
fruit.
case at the moment.
Reproduction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
How does that organization
Yes.
now reproduce
Yeah,
itself
yes.
under different conditions of political authority?
And then
Yeah.
how they, maneuvering the situation under different challenges around themselves, the PKK and the
Yeah, yeah.
Wanita.
Because they
Yeah,
are
that's
local.
very interesting
Yeah.
discussion on that
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
Yeah. Anyone would like to asking any question, suggestion, or maybe pointing out your opinion about? Okay, ya, silakan Ibu.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Lydia Nabitupulu. I'm with the Faculty of Economics, Universitas Indonesia, and also affiliated with the ANU Indonesia project.
Oh, yeah.
Welcome back, Ibu Kathy. So I was listening about the discussion on domestic role, and right now I think some of the concern is that there is low total fertility rate in Indonesia, so we are actually entering depopulation. So I'm not sure if I'm reading the data correctly, but it seems that we are heading that way. Indonesia is heading that way, as also other countries in East Asia like Japan, South Korea, China. On the other hand, the marriage rate is also decreasing and divorce rate is increasing. I want to
So
get
divorce is
increasing, especially in urban areas. And a lot of these, when I read the papers, it says that the reason is economy, alasan ekonomi, which is, I don't know, a lot of people maybe don't want to say the real reason, so they just put that, or that is the real reason. I'm not really sure. So I want to get your opinion on what do you think these trends will impact the gender order? Maybe if you haven't looked into this deeply, maybe you can have your initial overview, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. But it seems to me that you can't have a mass program for promoting fertility control without changing the way people think about themselves as fertile beings. And so, for example, one of the things that I've written in something that I've a long time ago was that there's been a change in male sexuality from women being the ones that are predominantly the ones using family planning. So, for example, in a lot of village situations in Indonesia, you had very long postpartum sex taboos, like men couldn't have sex with their wives while they were lactating, which often would be for up to 2 years. And I remember years ago when I did this research, the WHO statistics showed that postpartum lactational amenorrhea was the most important factor in the world in limiting births. But once women are on, in a mass way on contraception, excuse me, talking about sex, but it's like as if, women are always there, always ready for sex. So so men no longer, again, reproduction. You no longer have a situation where part of being a man, a definition of masculinity, a good man is a man whose wife doesn't have children too often. And I heard that when I first started doing research in village Indonesia, people were critical of men if women had children too close together. Wasn't the woman who got, or she might get criticised, but it was the man's fault, no discipline, can't control himself. So I think that it changes the way people think about themselves as sexual beings, both men and women, when you've got mass. So just taking away the distribution of contraception is not instantly going to change that, you know. And also, I'm sure that it's the same. I don't know. You'd know. I don't. Well, I can ask you the question. I mean, you know, when I first started doing research in Indonesia, in the village situation where I was, the blessed couple were the couple where she never menstruated again after the wedding. You know, she got pregnant straight away, right? That's in a village setting. But I wonder, I don't know, but say young professionals, are they like, yeah, I don't know the answer to this question, but are they like young professionals in Australia where they say, like, we've got married, but we don't want to have children anymore, so we're quite deliberately going to use contraception to delay the onset of childbearing until we've finished university, got a promotion, bought a, I don't know, whatever reason, those sorts of reasons that young people have. So I wonder how much that's going on, you know, and also that, I mean, people used to talk a lot about the old value of children approach. And I found that interesting when I was doing research in this place where people lost their agricultural land, because the value of children approach, which was an argument for the reasons why, explaining why poor farmers had a lot of children, it basically came down to the fact that if children, if there was an occupational niche they could be slotted into, you know, they could weed, they could look after the buffalo, you know, then children were seen as a blessing, right? But in Sarawak, it happened really quickly. Really quickly, when people lost their agricultural land, they moved really quickly to a situation where people wanted 2, maybe 3 children. Because the way they explained it to me, they said things like, they were given a bakal by their parents. The bakal from their parents was rice land, coconut trees, buffaloes. But they said, what's the bakal that we have to give to our children? It's education. You know, they really quickly grasped that their future was tied up with this big factory, you know, and that they said, what's the difference between those people up there and us? Only education. So that immediately had an impact on their desire for families, for family size, you know. So I think that must be, I'm assuming that that's probably general. You know, education's expensive. You've got to, if you've got lots of children, you've got to have a bigger house. I know from that you've increasingly got a situation in Indonesia where, as I understand it, the biggest obstacle to women's workforce participation is childcare, because people no longer live in situations where mum or grandma lives next door, or auntie's down the road, or there's a young cousin who's tamat SD, who can come and live in your house because she's finishing high school. All those factors impact on the ways people make decisions about having children, reproduction. You know, the decisions about family size and having children are reproduced in these changing social and economic contexts. Divorce? I don't know. Divorce, that's interesting. Have you got a theory about why divorce? I mean, maybe women are more aware now of the rights they have. I also marked a thesis on divorce in Malaysia. I don't remember the detail, but, you know, Indonesia's got this way that through the marriage law and the surat kat talak and all that kind of, yeah, that women actually are the minute they're married, they're given understanding of that they have rights to ask for divorce, you know, if the husband doesn't support them, blah, blah, blah. And in Malaysia, there's a similar legal, it's not the same thing, but there's also, I can't remember what it is, but there's a legal thing that in fact gives Muslim women the right to initiate talaq under certain circumstances. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to know if today's women are more aware of what their rights are, and maybe if this is a directive from the Department of Agama, I don't know if it's true or not, what the imam told me, but I have seen it in other communities where the imam does this, where he makes the woman, he ensures that the woman hears those conditions when she's, what do you know, Adeline, about that? If that's a common practice, that the woman gets to hear the reading of the Surat Talak by the husband from the buku nikah at the time of the taklik talak, yeah. Yeah, itu, yeah. So is that a directive from the Department of Agama that the woman has to hear it at the time of the akad nikah? Don't do it, that's right. I asked the imam in Sorowako, who's a wonderful man. We went to another wedding and a different imam did it. And I said, why didn't he do that? And he said, belum sempurna, which was very tactful. Yeah, no, that's interesting. But I'm wondering if that'd be an interesting research question if that's, I don't know how you do it, but if that's now more common so that women have more knowledge that that they know the kinds of circumstances under which they can initiate divorce. Maybe is there less stigma? Is there less stigma about divorce? Because it used to be huge stigma, didn't it? The janda, and the janda was such a, talk about your horror movies. I'm sure there's lots of jandas in the horror movies, Anyway, but no, very interesting things to think about. And really important for talking about the situation of women and gendered power and gender equity. Yeah. Ah. You okay? What's janda kembang? What's janda kembang? Because before they have children. Oh. Yeah, jadi masih ada sempat. Okay. Still stigma, but different. Apa?
50 years of engagement. It's really extraordinary. Oh, okay. And maybe you also witnessing that the influence of religion to the society and especially on gender relation is becoming stronger after reformation.
Yeah.
And you could find, for example, in the regional bylaws, using interpretation of religion to transform to the bylaws.
Yeah.
That's also something in Indonesia. Yes, we have progress. There are many laws has been passed for the last 25 years, especially in the, I think 99 to 29, there are many laws has been passed with a gender perspective, including domestic violence law, nationality laws, and witness protection with a gender perspective. Many others, because the women's group try so hard to put gender perspective and do advocacy work until now. We have 20 years of the domestic worker protection law has not been passed. It's also because of, I think, privilege of the anggota DPR and also what is bias, class bias, feudalism, and so on.
It's because I would say that's a good example of intersectionality. They're men, but they're elite men. And, and those two things go together to create their power and their privilege. It's not just that they're men, but they're also elite men.
Yeah, but unfortunately, we have speaker, the Ketua DPR, women.
Yeah.
And yesterday, the group did a hearing in the Legislative Council in DPR, and one of the women parliamentarians say, like, look at, I control via CCTV that my PRT doesn't work.
Oh, yeah.
Just diam-diam saja di.
Yeah.
So that's the situation.
So not all women have a feminist consciousness, or not all.
No. Sometimes I so regret why for since 98 we work so hard to ensure that the affirmative action policy is implemented in Indonesia. But yeah, we have a progress. Mia paper is very good. But yeah, there are many
Still
obstacles in getting or having women's candidate with a gender perspective, because most of them, I think 49%, should belong to the saudara of the political party leadership, and also the elite.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think about this?
I think about I think about a lot of those things. I think the Perda Sharia is interesting, that certainly in Sulawesi Selatan, a lot of the Perda Sharia were implemented not by Islamic parties, but by the secular parties, because they thought this would help their. But what interested me, like some of the ones, like in Bulukumba, for example, some of the Perda Sharia reflected not so much Islamic doctrine, but Bugis Islamic practice. Seperti, Adeline might disagree with me, but you know, for example, in Bugis culture, it's really common to have this tamatkan Al-Quran the night before the wedding, which is done in all sorts of different ways, but it's a cultural practice, right? It's not a religious practice. But the Bulukumba Perda Sharia had a rule that you had to show you were literate in the Quran before you could get married. And of course, that didn't last very long, because it came up against the other issues about marriage in that community. That, you know, marriage negotiations go on for a very long time, often kept secret for a very long time, and they involve a lot of money. And if you go down to the Kantor Urusan Agama and they, I've tested you and you can't get married, how would the parents react? Really angry, because they'd be shamed. So I think the Perda Sharia reflects a kind, although I must say I was a bit surprised how dry Makassar is, you know, no beer inside, you know, it's very dry. But anyway, so stop, but so I think one of the things I'd say that's a positive thing, I think Indonesian women activists, you know, you've got the Kaukus Perempuan Politik, and so you've got the Kaukus outside the parliament and the Kaukus inside the parliament. So I think women are really well organised, you know, they're really good at using all their power. But the basic fact is, we know in all cultures we start from unequal gender relations, right? Why would men give up power? They don't. Nobody gives up power. Nobody says, oh, I'm going to give up my power. Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, that's right. I've behaved unfairly. Like, for example, when I was appointed to ANU, I was appointed to an affirmative action position because there were no women. There was something like 12 women. There were very few women senior academics at ANU. So they had this affirmative action round and I got this job. The selection was like nothing you've ever seen. I've never seen anything like it. There are as many people as this, sitting around the table, most of the men, grilling me. And that they had 80 applicants for these positions, whereas normally for senior positions, you're lucky if you get 6 or 8. So it's a very competitive field, you know. But I really felt, you know, one of the, I can say this now because I'm old and the person in question's dead, but one of the senior professors, someone I really respected, he said to me, oh, well, we asked so-and-so, who was a guy, one of his PhD students who was a lecturer at the university I was coming from. We asked him and he said, you're all right, so we'll accept you. You know, like there was a suspicion, right? You know, because there were hardly any women and they weren't ready to give it up. You know, and I saw it in selection committees where you'd have to really fight, where in the university you'd have to fight because the men wanted to favour a candidate who looked like them, even if you could see on the objective criteria they weren't the best candidate. And it wasn't always because they were, are we still recording this? It wasn't always because, it wasn't just about being woman, and it was also about not being white. You know, so in one selection committee, they wanted to appoint this fellow who I knew would be terrible because I'd had experience of him in another context. And there was a perfectly wonderful male, but well qualified scholar from the region that the job was, because our jobs all had a label attached to them, you know, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, East Asia, blah, blah, blah. This person was from the region, wonderful scholar, blah, blah, blah. They wanted to give it to this fellow. And I said, I don't think he meets the selection criteria. But the men had all been wanting to go, oh, let's give him the job. And of course, the administrative secretary said, oh, you know, and so then it didn't happen. And the brown person got the job. But, you know, people don't want to give up power. And I don't know about other institutions, but in universities, they want people who look like them. There's a lot of research that shows that. People want to replace people who look like them. They want to take the risk on someone who's has a disability or who's of a different sex or different color. So it's nobody gives up power readily, right?
Yeah.
Some of us do. I'm not interested in power. I don't care.
Yeah.
You know, I don't get any satisfaction out of, except if I can use power to, you know, achieve nice things for people. But a lot of people, it really matters to them, you know, so men aren't going to give up easily. So I suppose that's my answer, that so women have to struggle for, it's just like I'm sure in Indonesia, people from regions outside of Java still have to struggle more to get things than people from Java, because there's often a prejudice that they can't be as well educated or as clever or, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, so
Yeah.
no one ever gives up power willingly. That's what I would say, Nushabani, but you're very good at making them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof.
No.
Katie. I think
No, don't use culture. Culture is never a reason. Culture is never a reason. We have to, if you're going to say a cultural factor is the reason for something, you have to explain why. Like Jim Fox said to me when I was a young student, culture is never an explanation. You know, culture is something that we explain. So if there is a
sometimes we
factor,
create as well.
we create it,
culture,
so we have to explain it. If someone's using an excuse
Yeah.
of culture, then that's the thing we have to explain.
Yeah.
Did he say that to you too, Adley?
Yeah. But I think
But Jim.
we have this Friday prayer time. So
Yes.
So
yes,
I'm
yes.
so sorry to
No, no.
stop everybody before 12. Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Katie, for wonderful talk today. We has travel around Indonesia from Sorowako to PKK in urban area, as well as understanding about the dimension of gender and power, in which not only in public spaces, but also intimate power, starting from the relationship between husband and wife, as we're talking about the divorce issue and everything. And then the second highlighted from Professor Kathryn public lecture is we are as an Indonesian should be aware of the characteristic and situation among us, which is interesting to be researched. Professor Kathryn, an Australian and researcher outside Indonesia, can reflect to the situation which is interesting for her. But sometimes us as an Indonesian, because it's too close with the reality, so we doesn't think any interested of the, a situation in Indonesia. For example, we're talking about wiritan, but for Prof. Kathy, it is very interesting. But perhaps for us, it's, what is that wiritan? But this is very academically interesting to be looked at further. And so exactly that is what I'm learning from Professor Kathy when I was a student in ANU. So looking around, see your surrounding area, because there is a lot of interesting thing to be observed and academically proven, with academic and methodologically. So I think I stop there. And thank you so much, Professor Kathy, for your wonderful lecture today. So I give it to MC.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kurniawati and Professor Kathryn, for bringing us a very insightful discussion today. And we have come to an end of our occasion. On behalf of the Research Center for Politics, we would like to say thank you for your active participation today. But before we end our occasion, we kindly invite all of the participation to have a group photo session with Professor Kathryn, please. Thank you very much and have a nice day, everyone. Di mana? Bagus. Di mana, Mbak? Di depan mana? BRIN itu ya? Oh, ya. Bapak Ibu, foto bersama akan dilaksanakan di depan. Kalau boleh kita sama-sama, iya, iya. Mari kita sama-sama menuju tempat foto bersama, Bapak Ibu. Iya, yang ada di dekat lift. Ya, terima kasih.